Hello and welcome to The Art of Aging, part of our podcast series from the Center for Abundant Aging in United Church Homes. I love having conversations with others as we look at what it means to age in the 21st century, encouraging positive and empowering conversations that challenge, encourage, and inspire all to age with abundance. Today, I have the joy of welcoming Dr. Catrinel Tromp. She is a Romanian-born cognitive psychologist who studies creativity. Currently, she's a professor at Rider University in Lawrenceville, New Jersey. And in between her completion of her own education and PhD from Princeton and her work at Rider, she worked for a hedge fund and co-owned a recruiting firm in Manhattan. Catrinel is also a mother and a painter. And on October 31st, 2025, about 6 weeks from now, she will be the keynote speaker at our own annual symposium, which is a hybrid event held here in Columbus, Ohio, with access online via Zoom. More information about that a little later. Welcome, Catrinel.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to speak with you.
So, what sparked your initial curiosity about how people think differently in creative problem solving? And how did that lead you to focus on the creative thinking process in general?
Yes, I think I've always had a sense of wonder and also a deep appreciation for just how creative people can be, both at the transformative, what we call big C creativity level, famous works of art and scientific discoveries that are considered breakthrough and inventions and so on, but also in terms of what I think are perhaps less glamorous, but equally intriguing and important day-to-day creative problem solving and instances of adaptability and resourcefulness. So with my background in cognitive psychology, which is really the study of the mind, really the mental processes that underlie behavior and how we interact with the external world, I became increasingly interested not only in what people create, but also how their minds get there. And creativity is certainly challenging to study. It's a complex, higher order type of processing that relies on all these other cognitive functions interacting dynamically. And it is challenging to study, but I think it is possible, and it's really important to understand how people think creatively. So this how really became my main interest. And then I began to zoom in and test more specific ideas, especially about creativity and constraints.
I find this fascinating, Catrinel. I have always been intrigued by creativity. I can remember going to a leadership event when I was a youth, and I took a seminar in creativity. My mom was an early childhood educator, and I never had coloring books. She said, "You need to be creative. Here's the piece of paper. Here are the crayons or markers, and you create the image. You don't have to color in anybody else's lines." So I
Right.
find it, so that's been kind of the construct for me for creativity for a long time. But I find that your research and talking about constraints to be fascinating. And I also understand now a little bit how they do work with the creative process. So you've written about Dr. Seuss and how strict constraints can actually spark greater creativity. Can you share why people often produce more innovative ideas when faced with limitations rather than total freedom?
Yes. Yes, one of my earlier articles I titled The Green Eggs and Ham Hypothesis. Really, and the title was inspired by this anecdote that Dr. Seuss, Theodore Geisel, really was challenged by his publisher to write a children's bestseller using a really tight constraint, no more than 50 of the same words. And so this was a nice anecdote, and I wanted to test it experimentally. And I did, and I found support for this green eggs and ham hypothesis, which shows, again, that constraints can benefit creativity rather than hinder it, which most people would assume is the case. And you ask a really important question, which is why? Why is it that limitations can promote creative thinking. And something that I thought about early on is that people don't seem to create ideas in a vacuum. They respond to something, either a problem that they face or a stimulus. It could be internal, maybe a memory that comes to mind, could be external, maybe something they learned during a conversation with a friend or a colleague, or something that they noticed during a walk, let's say in nature. Whatever the case might be, it's something that strikes a chord and becomes perhaps a source of inspiration and also prompts them to explore new possibilities more deeply. And so, really, I've come to argue that constraints are the building blocks of creativity. And the simple, well, perhaps not so simple, but a straightforward way to think about it is that they provide a scaffolding and a structure to iterate against. And they also change the nature of the search from broad, open ended, and more superficial to more in depth, more structured, and perhaps less superficial and more interesting, more likely to reveal unusual combinations that others haven't run into. And so, in fact, when I talk about very open-ended tasks, creative tasks, I call them constraint hungry. So by narrowing the task, this really open-ended task, and anchoring it in some way, constraints encourage a deeper exploration. So instead of flitting and skimming the surface, and sometimes also kind of endlessly starting over, because there are many other possibilities available to explore, instead, when constraints are present, they invite us to pause, slow down, explore beyond the surface level cliches, and engage in a deeper exploration.
Fascinating. Constraint hungry. Wow. That's gonna be playing in my head as I work with that for a while. Um, so how did your research on creativity and constraints and being constraint hungry evolve into study creative aging, particularly the idea that older adults face inevitable physical, cognitive, and emotional limitations, but can draw on their life experiences to navigate them more creatively?
Yes, that actually I thought about this a few months ago. It's an interesting question, and I think to answer it, I'm going to first distinguish between two types of constraints. And of course, there are many ways to categorize constraints, but I think this distinction is especially relevant here between what I call focusing and exclusionary constraints, do's and don'ts.
Hmm.
And they're complementary, they work in tandem to define what is possible. And just like you can think of the negative and positive space in a painting. And then when I was starting to think about how constraints change across development and across the lifespan, at first it was tempting to assume that aging brings more constraints than other periods of life. And then I thought about it more, and I realized that actually constraints are present across the entire lifespan, across all stages of development. They differ, of course, in their nature, but they really are ubiquitous. And what I think changes, perhaps, is that older adults increasingly encounter more exclusionary constraints later in life. And so we hear more don'ts, couldn'ts, shouldn'ts. And yes, some of these can be physical. So perhaps a knee injury that decreases mobility, decline in vision, hearing loss, and so on. And some are societal. After a certain age, you couldn't, or you can't, or you shouldn't do this or that. And what's interesting is that we know from classic research on what's called thought suppression that any attempt to avoid a particular thought, in the classic example, it's don't think of a white bear, those attempts aren't easily successful. And in fact, whatever thought we're trying to block, be it a white bear or the thought of a disability or an impairment, tends to rebound. And so any reminders of what one cannot or should not do, no longer do, for example, for older age, tend to backfire and, in fact, make those thoughts even more salient and they loom even larger in our minds. And what we also know from the same line of research is that directing attention towards something else that's also salient, in the classic example, don't think of a white bear, think of a red Corvette. This tends to lessen those rebound effects. So, with respect to creativity, it's really important to find focusing constraints. And I think this applies for individuals and communities and organizational structures alike. I think everyone should try to find and create opportunities that focus attention towards something, a creative activity, a new area of focus, or reigniting and rediscovering older ones, rather than just focusing on what one can no longer do.
Yeah, so it seems to me that ageism and ableism have a role then in suppressing creativity and convincing us as we age that we aren't creative or we aren't creative as we were earlier in life, because those ageism and ableism, the negative thoughts, the way we think, feel, and act about ourselves or others based on how old we think they are, that would be the constraining, right? Focus.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, you're right. There's still, if there's one aspect to aging and to research on aging that's undisputed and universal, is this role of attitudes and more broadly mindset toward aging. And yes, there's some both at the individual and at the social cultural level. So at the individual level, we know, as you pointed out, that self-ageism exists. So this internal narrative really shapes also how we view constraints, whether we appraise them as obstacles and annoying things to be avoided, or if we try to navigate them and explore possibilities, even within whatever constraint it is that we might be facing. And then at the societal level, yes, we have a problem still. I think things are changing, at least like as far as I can tell, there's progress in the right direction, but largely the prevailing narrative is still that, well, really viewing aging as a period of decline and deterioration and loss, and really something to be endured or softened or even medicated. And, rather than a period of potentially of expansion and growth in line with that phrase, right? Growing old, also in terms of creativity. So I think, if we think about what can we do about it, especially for some people who enter older age without having been challenged earlier in life, well, I think this is where creative practice and experience can serve as a buffer to all these social attitudinal concerns and attitudes.
So I view creativity as a very positive, life affirming. I can talk theologically about creativity. And do you think creativity is held up within our culture as continuing to be something that's creative? I mean, is it helpful to help demonstrate to older adults or help share and help them think, oh, I am creative? I don't know. That's just.
I think so. It's really difficult to generalize. Of course, we talk about the United States. It might be a very different story elsewhere in the world. And even within the US, there are pockets of perhaps communities and initiatives where creativity is valued and reinforced, also in older communities. So perhaps it's harder to generalize, but I definitely think, well, I am biased, of course, but I think creativity should be prized, and not just in terms of these high-level creative achievements that we hear about in the news and read about in textbooks, but also again, at the day-to-day creative problem solving kind of level, um, and building creative resilience by practicing creativity in that way too, day in and day out, and also playing around with different constraints, I think that's really important. There's no doubt in my mind, and perhaps there's doubt in society, but maybe we can change that.
Is that you had mentioned earlier big C creativity? Is that the difference between big C and small C creativity?
Yes, there are various ways to look at it, but really, there's big C and then there's pro C, professional creativity. This isn't quite transformative, and usually one can achieve big C after you have passed away. So if indeed it holds the test of time, so to speak. And then there's mini C and little c. But yes, the distinction largely is that, is it the sort of level that impacts many, many people and is acknowledged as being transformative by several important bodies in a society, for example, as opposed to my child or my spouse and my community.
Yeah.
But again, both are really important. And I think we should remember that creativity is a process. It's always tempting to think of it in terms of people and products, but it's really a process. And if we view it like this, we realize that it's really manifests itself everywhere.
Yeah, I think, one of the challenges that too often we associate the word creativity only with artistic endeavors.
Yes. Yes.
And not everyone has the same level of artistic abilities. I have a relative who is a teacher, and she always insists that she's not creative. She doesn't feel like she can create beautiful things. And I keep telling her, teaching is a very creative profession because you are always taking, to take your knowledge and the goals of the lesson plan and meet the child where they are on any particular day. That is extremely creative because there are times when you're developing new ways of doing things or helping to create new pictures for that child that you haven't done before. That's creativity.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And yes, so I think there's these myths that prevail in society, unfortunately. I mean, we can try to dispel them. I think that's the only way to do it really, is by informing and talking about it. And we can try to do some of this here, just dispelling this idea that creativity is limited to a particular type of person, a particular domain or task or level or age group, right? And again, creativity does encompass all those things that do come to mind when people hear the word creativity: artists and writers, and maybe to some degree now entrepreneurs, especially young entrepreneurs and content creators and YouTubers. Sure, those are examples of creativity, but they're only that, examples. And again, viewing creativity as a process and realizing that it can manifest and shows up everywhere in life and also across all stages of life is really important, even in areas that you might think they don't count as creative, like your friend. And
Yeah.
certainly education and politics and so many areas are opportunities to think creatively.
Yeah, absolutely. So, are there things that we can be doing to help us build our creative muscle, to help train our brains and our ways of thinking to approach what could be seen as constraining, limiting situations to imagine something different?
Yes, that's a really great question, because I think you're right. Constraints have a very bad reputation. And yes, many people feel uncomfortable with them. They feel maybe overwhelmed by any creative task that also involves constraints. And then this in turn makes them less likely to even try, to just avoid it altogether. And yes, constraints sometimes, often in fact, make the task a little bit more challenging. But another way to think of it is that makes the task more manageable, and I would argue also more likely to be creatively productive in some way. And so, what advice to give for somebody who's feeling overwhelmed by constraints, or he doesn't like them? To go back to Dr. Seuss and Green Eggs and Ham, um, try them, and you may. I mean, a lot of times it's just a question of first just trying and realizing that sometimes constraints can actually be helpful, and just having an awareness of anecdotal and empirical evidence that show both, that constraints can benefit creativity. I think that's really helpful. Um, and something important I want to bring up here is that, um, I'm not saying that constraints will always guarantee a creative outcome. That's really not the case. I mean, if you imagine you and I, um, are playing in the kitchen and we have an open minded attitude, a playful, experimental attitude toward constraints, and let's say we draw ingredients from a hat, anything we have in our kitchen, and we start with, I don't know, vanilla extract. And then we draw another and we get eggplant. Um, that doesn't sound promising. And then we draw another one, and who knows, we get olives or pickles or something like that. And those are really unexpected combinations that are may not yield something creative, but we won't know until we try. And so that's what we mean when we say that creativity is non-deterministic. It's just a fancy word for saying who knows. And yes, even if we know the initial conditions, starting points, ingredients, really it's impossible to predict the outcome. But I think just the practice of playing around and experimenting with different constraints and just contemplating what's possible within them, that builds the sort of creative muscle and creative resilience that is really helpful, and an exploratory mindset, that I think is particularly grateful as we enter older age.
I once was in a workshop and the presenter was talking about young thinking and old thinking.
Hmm.
And what they were talking about was, um, um, are you're able to think expansively because you don't have experience and like you can't do this, you can't do that. That was young thinking. And for them, old thinking is, well, you come up with a new idea and you just automatically think what can't be done, what can't be done, and talking about having the need to open them up. And I after the workshop, I said, "Can we have a conversation?" And so we set up a time to talk. And I said, "Could you not call that young and old thinking?
Yes.
Because yes, as we age, we have experiences and we have had times when we've tried something and it hasn't worked. And so that may be our first, there could be a knee jerk reaction, but that doesn't mean that we can't open up and think of new possibilities, think about new ways of doing things. And don't label that young thinking and old
Goodness, yes,
thinking.
that is a really unfortunate label. I agree, and you're right. I think it's just a question of mindset, and I actually think people who are more creative than others don't differ that much in terms of the processes they use that they rely on, but more they just have a more playful attitude toward constraints, and they're more open-minded in the sense of open, not certainly not young, but they're just asking what if over and over again, and they're comfortable, just yeah, playing around with different constraints.
So you used the word playful and playing around, and I've done some reading along the way about the power of play
Mm.
and how the ways we have played throughout our life have established neurological pathways in our brains, then that we can use those pathways when we encounter other situations later. And really play is about being curious. Um,
Exactly.
and so how can we, when we come across constraints, how can we be curious then about, okay, these may be the constraints, but there's still all kinds of possibilities that we can do in the midst of those constraints. So for me, creativity and play are really closely tied together.
Absolutely. And they should be, and they are. And this does not, it should also include this idea of constraints. It sounds paradoxical, but really, if we think about so much, even leisure activities, games and sports, if we stop to think for a moment, they're highly constrained. They really are driven by structure, delineated parameters within which creative things can happen. Think of Scrabble and Taboo, the board game, and really all the sports. They have rules and areas, and things that one should do and should not do. Again, those exclusionary and focusing constraints. And then often, I would say, even entire systems of philosophy and religion and law. We think about the US Constitution, the Ten Commandments, they also rely on the structure of do's and don'ts. And I mean, even more broadly, just day-to-day life, I think, is just a matter of navigating an ongoing swirl of constraints, do's and don'ts. So if we view constraints like that, it's just a question of figuring out, well, how do we navigate them better? And the more comfortable we are and the more we have a playful attitude toward them, I think that this is really, really helpful, also longer term. And I should also point out there are different ways in which in which constraints differ. Another one that I would like to mention is the distinction between fixed and flexible constraints. So that, I think, is also something to think about as people navigate life, including the do's and don'ts, because many of the constraints that we assume to be fixed are in fact flexible, especially those related to aging and those prescriptive messages we hear from society. So just like mimes in a box, we act as if the constraints are real and the invisible walls are real, but actually they're not. They're often just constructed out of, all these don'ts are constructed out of fear or familiarity or convention, maybe family expectations, maybe social scripts and outdated norms. So I think it's really important to question assumptions and distinguish between these types of constraints, which are actually real and fixed, and you must work within, and those that are actually flexible.
I think an example of this, and this came up with a conversation with Liz Stam, who's a music therapist, and she talks about how when she's working with older adults, sometimes she'll go in and talk about how she's a music therapist, and they'll say, "Well, I'm not a musician," and she'll say, "Well, why aren't you a musician?" "Well, because my fifth grade teacher told me I couldn't sing." And immediately that's a constraint that teacher put up and said, "You can't do this." And so they believed it and so they don't believe they can sing. And yet literally 70 years later, that's still the constraint in their head that keeps them participating in activities where they might be able to sing.
That is heartbreaking, but it happens so often.
Yeah.
Really. And then, yes, I think that we should acquire this skill in questioning and is something that we think is real, is it really real? And just questioning assumptions.
Yeah.
Even if we've held them for a long time, for an entire life, in this case.
Well, Catrinel, we could talk for a very long time, and this isn't the end of our conversations because you're going to be with us for our symposium coming up on October 31st. But before we bring the podcast to a close, there are 3 questions that we ask each of our guests. Are you ready to answer the 3?
Ready, sure.
Okay. So when you think about your own aging, what has changed about you and what do you like about your older self?
I think what has changed is that I have a lot more data. And I don't mean scientific data or facts, or we have so much access to information, especially now with technology. But what I mean is, I, just like all of us as we are aging, we have accumulated years, decades after a while of trial and error. And in my case, I guess more emphasis on the error. But all these lived experiences
Yep.
are especially valuable for creativity. And they're also unique to us. These patterns of do's and don'ts, what we tried that worked and what works best for us and what our strengths and weaknesses are. I mean, these are unique, highly customized to each of us. But I think they're really raw fuel for creative thinking. And what I like about myself is that I now have a better scaffolding, better and stronger and more extensive scaffolding of these exclusionary and focusing constraints I've been bringing up. And that in turn, I think, makes me more creatively aware of what works and what doesn't work.
So you are taking the research that you do and applying it to your own life.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Certainly try, yes.
Yeah. And you're also taking your own experiences and taking that curiosity into your research. So yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
So what surprises you about what you're doing at your age right now?
Well, this podcast, for one, I think younger me wouldn't have dreamed or imagined that I would be sharing my research like this. And I don't think I would have also imagined working on anything related to aging. But both are really, really great surprises. So I'm quite grateful.
Well, thank you for being open and for trying
Of
something
course.
new. Yeah. And the last question is there someone that you've met or someone who set an example that inspires you to age abundantly?
I think there's so many people who are inspiring. If we look, if each of us looks around us, I mean, in my neighborhood and in at work among my colleagues and collaborators, certainly in my family, my parents in Romania and my mother-in-law in the Netherlands, they all age abundantly, but each in their own different way.
Yeah.
And there's so much beauty in that, I think, because there might be some overarching principles, maybe, but there really is no universal script for aging abundantly. Each writes their own, and I think there's that alone, I think, counts as an instance of creativity.
Exactly, exactly. And that's why we ask this question of everyone because there
Great.
there there are examples and we started doing this years ago and I heard an interview with Becca Levy soon after she published her book. I think that was in 2021 or 2022. And in the podcast, the person asked her, "So what should people doing?" And one of the things was she said, "We need to be keeping a list, a notebook, of those people who are aging ahead of us who set an example." And I thought, whoa, we've already been
Right.
doing that. And that's why, even though we narrow you down in this podcast to one, everybody who comes there has to choose from many. And you're right, it's helpful if we have many, because and even if we chose the same person, the reasons why we would choose that person are going to be different to us. So yeah,
That's right.
absolutely.
Well, I gave too broad of an answer, but I think it's in this case, I really think it's difficult to choose because there are different ways in which they age abundantly, and I would love to emulate
Yep.
them, each of them in different ways. Yeah, and I build my own version of abundant aging. Yeah,
You are creatively
exactly.
using the lessons that they're demonstrating. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Catrinel. If anybody wants to be in touch, where can they find you, or how could they reach out to you?
Well, I think I have a unique enough combination, an unusual combination of first and last name. So any search on the internet will take you to my art website if you're interested, and certainly my professional website at Rider University. And my email is ctromp, Tromp, at rider.edu.
Thank you. And I have been to both websites, and I can say you really should check out her art website as well. It's
Very kind of you.
beautiful,
Thank you.
beautiful. Well, thank you. And thank you to our listeners for your time with this episode of The Art of Aging, part of our Abundant Aging series at United Church Homes. If you would like to participate in additional conversations around this theme of creativity, I invite you to check out our 2025 symposium, which will take place, as I mentioned, on October 31st. You can join us in person in Lewis Center, Ohio, or online from anywhere. And you can find the registration page on our website at abundantaging.org. Or if you're catching this conversation after that date, you can visit our website, abundantaging.org, to explore this topic and more. In the meantime, may you look around you and identify just one person today who is aging ahead of you, who influences your understanding of how you can age abundantly by their aging example. And then tomorrow you can look for somebody else. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the conversation, Catrinel.
It's been a
And
pleasure. Thank
until
you.
next time, stay connected.